Hey, Sleepy America family. Welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time tonight, I'm so glad you're here. Find a comfortable position. Let the darkness settle around you. And know that what you're about to hear is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the world. But if you were here for part 1, then you already know. You know the steppe. You know the wind. You know the Onon River and the sacred mountain of Burkhan, Kaldun and the felled Jers glowing in the darkness, like lanterns on an infinite sea of grass. You know the boy who was born clutching blood in his right fist. You know the father who was poisoned on a road. You know the mother who dug for roots in frozen ground and told her children through everything, through every catastrophe, through every winter that should have killed them, we do not give up. You know the teenager who escaped slavery with a wooden collar around his neck, hiding in a freezing river while searchers passed within feet of him. You know the young man who rode to claim his bride and came home to find her taken. You know the warrior who built alliances from nothing, from pride and loyalty and the absolute, unshakable certainty that the sky itself had chosen him. You know Temujin. You know what he became. In part 1, we watched the world change. We stood on the steppe before Genghis Khan was born, in that ancient, brutal, beautiful world of divided tribes and endless feuds and grass stretching to every horizon. We watched a boy lose everything and refuse to stay lost. We watched a man rise from nothing, from slavery, from poverty, from abandonment, to unify every tribe on the Mongolian plateau under one law and one sky. We watched him conquer China. We watched him turn west and destroy the Khwarezmian Empire, because a provincial governor made a catastrophic mistake and a Shah was too proud to apologize. We watched his generals ride through the Caucasus and into Russia and to the edge of Europe, and then turn back, not because anything stopped them, but because a man died in Mongolia. We watched the empire reach its height. 4,000,000 square miles. One law. One road. The most connected the world had ever been. And then we left it there, at the height. At the peak, at the moment before the long descent begins. Tonight, we follow it down. Not with sadness. Not with the simple story of decline that history textbooks tell, where empires rise and empires fall and the moral is always the same. The story of what the Mongol Empire became, what it left behind, what it destroyed, what it created, what it changed forever, is not a story of simple decline. It is a story of transformation. Tonight, in part 2, we ask the questions that part 1 was building toward all along. How did they do it? What was the machine that made the largest empire in history possible? The tactics, the weapons, the psychology, the genius that turned 100,000 horsemen into something no civilization on Earth could face and survive? What happened when the empire broke apart? When the 4 Khanates went their separate ways, and each became something its founders could not have imagined? And the biggest question of all, what did it mean? What does an empire that killed 40 million people and connected the entire world leave behind? How do you weigh the burning of Baghdad against the roads that carried the Renaissance? How do you hold the Black Death and the Silk Road in the same hand and make sense of them? Was Genghis Khan a monster? Was he the man who made the modern world? Was he both? Tonight we find out. The steppe is waiting. The story is not finished. Let's ride. To understand the Mongol Empire, you must first understand the army that built it. not as a collection of battles, not as a list of cities destroyed and kingdoms conquered, not as numbers, though the numbers are staggering, though the scale of what this army accomplished in a single generation of campaigning has never been matched in the history of human warfare. You must understand it as a system, because that is what it was, not a horde. That word borrowed from the Mongol Orda, and distorted by centuries of European fear into something that meant chaos. That meant savage and uncontrolled and mindless, not that. Never that. A system designed by one of the greatest military minds the world has ever produced, refined over decades of continuous warfare, tested against every military tradition on the Eurasian continent and found, without exception, superior to all of them. The Mongol army was not the largest force in the world. This is the first thing that must be said, the first misconception that must be cleared away. At no point in the history of the empire did the Mongols field an army numerically superior to the forces they faced. The Jin dynasty had more soldiers. The Khwarezmian Empire had more soldiers. The Song dynasty, which held out against the Mongols for 45 years, had vastly more soldiers. Numbers were never the point. What mattered was the system. What mattered was whether the men you had trained moved faster, thought faster, adapted faster, endured more, coordinated better, and hit harder than the men opposing them. The Mongol system was superior to every system it encountered, not by accident, not by luck, not by some mystical ferocity that nomadic peoples supposedly carry in their blood. Superior because Genghis Khan and the commanders he trained spent decades studying war with the obsessive attention of genius, watching what worked and refining it, watching what failed and discarding it, borrowing from every enemy they defeated and integrating what was useful and throwing away what was not. Begin with the foundation. Begin with the horse. The Mongol horse was not beautiful by any conventional standard. Not the sleek Arabian thoroughbreds that Persian and Arab cavalry prized. Not the massive war horses that European knights rode into battle, animals so large they needed years of specialized training and enormous quantities of grain to sustain. The Mongol horse was small, 13 to 14 hands, stocky, short-legged, with a thick neck and a shaggy coat that made it look almost comical beside the animals of the settled world. It was also essentially indestructible. The Mongol horse survived on grass alone, pawing through snow to find it in winter, sustaining itself on the sparse vegetation of desert margins in summer, without grain, supplements, without shelter, without the elaborate care that war horses of settled armies required. It could travel 60 to 80 miles in a single day under a rider, and then do it again the next day and the day after that. Cold resistant, heat tolerant, sure-footed on terrain that would break the legs of larger animals. And each Mongol warrior rode not one horse, but 3, 4, sometimes 5 or 6. A string of remounts that allowed him to cover distances that seemed physically impossible to armies that did not understand the system. When one horse tired, he switched to another. The tired horse continued at a walk, catching up at the next halt. The rider was always on a fresh animal. The army never stopped for its horses. No other military force on earth could match the Mongol rate of march. Consider what this meant in practice. The Russian campaign of 1237 to 1238 conducted in deep winter, across frozen terrain, against an enemy who believed the season itself was their greatest defense. Saw Mongol columns covering ground that modern military historians, working through the mathematics, still struggle to fully credit. Ryazan fell. Vladimir fell. A dozen cities fell in the space of 3 months, each one seeming impossibly distant from the last, the Mongols appearing before walls before the city even knew the previous city had been attacked. The speed was the weapon. Not just tactically, not merely in the sense of arriving before defenses could be organized, though that alone was devastating enough. Strategically, psychologically, an army that moves faster than information about its own movements creates a specific and irreplaceable terror, the terror of not knowing, of hearing that the Mongols are 100 miles away and discovering 3 days later that they are at your gates. Terror was a tool. The Mongols understood this with a precision that modern psychological warfare doctrine would recognize immediately. They cultivated their reputation deliberately, using it as a force multiplier, making their actual military strength work harder by ensuring the enemy was already half defeated before the first arrow was fired. The system was simple and ruthless and consistent. A city that surrendered without resistance was treated with relative mercy. Its people were not killed. Its buildings were not burned. Taxes would be levied. Skilled craftsmen might be taken. A garrison installed. But the city survived. Life, changed but recognizable, continued. A city that resisted and fell was destroyed. Comprehensively. The population killed or enslaved. The buildings leveled. Sometimes the very site was salted, plowed under, returned to grazing land. As if the city had never existed, as if the presumption of its resistance had unmade its right to exist at all. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was policy, calculated and consistent, and administered with the same cold precision as every other element of the Mongol system. Because the next city on the road heard what happened to the city that resisted. The next city heard what happened to the city that surrendered. And the calculation that the next city made, its rulers in their council chambers, its population, in its streets and markets and temples. Every person with something to lose, weighing the same terrible arithmetic, was made with that information fully present. Resist and certainly be destroyed. Submit and possibly survive. Walls became traps rather than defenses. The people inside them became pressure on their own leadership. Open the gates. Do not make us pay for your pride. Genghis Khan turned the psychology of urban civilization against itself. Cities were built to be refuges. The Mongols made them coffins. And then, before the walls, before the siege engines, before the cavalry charge that ended every battle, there was the arrow. Everything the Mongol army did was built around the bow. Not the sword. Not the lance. Not the armored charge that defined European knighthood in this same era. The bow, short, recurved, composite. A technological marvel of horn and sinew, and would laminate it under heat and pressure into a shape that stored and released energy with an efficiency no straight-grained wooden bow could approach. It had a draw weight of between 100 and 160 pounds. It could drive an arrow through light armor at 200 meters. It could be fired from The back of a galloping horse. That last point requires a moment. A galloping horse moves at 30 miles per hour. The rider on that horse is moving. With it, bouncing, swaying, absorbing the shock of hooves on ground through every joint in his body. To fire an arrow accurately from this platform requires a physical integration with the horse, so complete that the rider is no longer entirely a rider. He is part of the animal, his body compensating automatically for every movement, his hands free and steady at the moment of release because every other part of him has handled the problem of balance without conscious thought. Mongol warriors had been doing this since they were 4 years old. The horse was not a vehicle to them. It was an extension of the body. And the bow was not a weapon. It was a hand, reaching further than flesh could reach, striking what could not otherwise be struck, killing from a distance that made the Mongols effectively untouchable to any enemy that could not match their mobility. In battle, a unit of Mongol cavalry delivered a volume of arrows that no infantry formation could withstand. Without breaking, they did not close to hand-to-hand distance unless they chose to. They circled. They shot. They moved. They shot again. They offered no static target, because you cannot reliably hit something moving at 30 miles per hour in an unpredictable pattern with the weapons available in the 13th century. They were ghosts. They killed from a distance. And when you pursued them, when the frustration and the casualties and the maddening evasiveness of it finally broke your formation and sent your soldiers charging after the retreating horsemen, the trap closed. The feigned retreat. If one tactic defines the Mongol way of war above all others, above the speed, above the arrows, above the psychological architecture of terror they built so carefully before every campaign, it is this: the feigned retreat. It worked every time. This is the thing that confounds modern military analysts more than almost anything else about the Mongol record. Enemies were warned. Survivors of previous battles described it in detail. Commanders who had read the accounts, who knew exactly what was coming, who briefed their officers before battle and said, "When they run, do not pursue. It is a trap, hold your formation." Still watched their men break and chase and die. Because it worked not against tactics, not against training, against human nature. And human nature does not change because you have been warned. The mechanics were these. A Mongol force would engage, pressing, shooting, threatening, making itself visible and aggressive. The enemy would form up, would begin to push back. And then, suddenly, the Mongols would turn and run. Not in chaos. Not in the broken, scattered flight of a genuinely defeated force. In disciplined, organized retreat, which paradoxically made it look more convincing. Because a routed army flees in whatever direction individual panic sends it, while these retreating horsemen all moved the same way, as if pulled by a single string. As if whatever was behind them was worth running from together. The enemy saw them running and felt the surge, that ancient, animal surge of battle that no training fully suppresses. We are winning. They are running. Chase them. Chase them now, before they rally, before they regroup, before the victory that is right there in front of us disappears into the steppe. Formation broke. Pursuit began. And the Mongols led them, at precisely The speed required to keep the pursuers committed, fast enough that they could never quite catch up, slow enough that they never quite gave up toward whatever had been prepared. Sometimes a narrow defile, where cavalry lost its room and Mongol archers on the heights above had easy targets moving slowly below. Sometimes a prepared position where a fresh Mongol force waited to strike the exhausted pursuers from flank or rear. Sometimes simply terrain that separated the fast riders from the slow ones that turned a pursuing army into scattered individuals who could be run down at leisure. The trap closed. The battle ended. What made the feigned retreat work? What made it work against warned enemies? Informed enemies, enemies who had studied the Mongol record, was the level of discipline required to execute it. It is not easy to turn and run in a controlled manner while under fire. It is not easy to regulate your pace precisely enough to stay just ahead of pursuit without opening so much distance that the enemy abandons the chase. It is not easy to do this for miles across difficult terrain while maintaining the situational awareness to know when the trap has closed and it is time to turn back into the fight. Mongol warriors trained years for this. The training happened in the Nerj, the Great Hunt. Genghis Khan used the annual Great Hunt not primarily as a food-gathering operation but as the most ambitious military training exercise ever conceived. The entire army, tens of thousands of warriors, would spread across hundreds of miles of steppe in a vast encircling line. For weeks, sometimes months, they drove inward, compressing the circle, herding every animal in the enclosed territory toward the center. Nothing was permitted to escape until the Khan gave the signal. The coordination required to maintain this circle, to ensure every section moved at the correct pace, that gaps did not open through which animals could escape, that messages traveled around the perimeter fast enough to respond to local situations, was precisely the coordination required to execute a multi-column military campaign across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. Every warrior who rode the Nij was practicing command and control, communication across vast distances, unit cohesion under pressure, the management of movement without being able to see or speak to the men on the far side of the circle. It was the greatest military training exercise ever devised, disguised as a hunt. The generals were the other element that made the system what it was. Genghis Khan found them. He created them. He gave them authority on a scale that no previous commander had been willing to extend, operational independence across thousands of miles, the trust to make decisions without reference back to the Khan, the resources to act, and the understanding that results, not process, were what mattered. Subutai, born Kamen, the son of a blacksmith. By some accounts, his rise through the Mongol system a living demonstration of everything the meritocracy was designed to enable. He had ridden with Genghis Khan from the early years, had conducted the Great Western Raid through Persia and the Caucasus into Russia with Jib, had fought at the Kalka River, had planned and executed the campaigns in Russia and Hungary that brought the Mongol army to the gates of Vienna. He was, by any serious military analysis, one of the greatest commanders in the history of warfare. Not the most famous. History has been unkind to Subutai, burying him under the names of the princes he served. but the most accomplished. The general, who fought across a greater geographic area against a greater variety of enemies with more consistent success than any other commander in the pre-modern world. He was 60 years old at Mohi, too heavy to ride a horse comfortably. He was carried to the battlefield in a cart. He was still the most dangerous mind in the room. Jeeb the Arrow, so called because he had shot Genghis Khan's horse from under him in battle before he joined the Mongol cause, and, when captured and brought before the Khan, admitted it without flinching. Genghis Khan, who valued honesty above almost everything, made him a commander on the spot. The man who had nearly killed him became one of his most trusted generals. Jeeb and Subutai rode the Great Western raid together, 5,000 miles of continuous campaigning, 3 years. Never defeated. Macaulay, left in command of the entire Chinese theater with the authority of a viceroy, prosecuted the war against the Jin for 12 years, without the Khan present to supervise. A single decision. Never faltered. Never exceeded his mandate. Never lost a campaign. These were not products of academies, not trained in the classical military traditions of any settled civilization. They were products of the steppe, of the nerj and the endless riding, and the practical education of actual combat, given authority that few rulers in history have been willing to extend, and turned loose on a world that had no answer for them. The siege engineers completed the picture, because the Mongols were not merely cavalry. This is the other great misconception, that they were a pure horse culture that broke against city walls. They did not break against city walls. After the early campaigns, when walled cities presented genuine problems, when the Mongols had to rely on blockade and starvation rather than direct assault, Genghis Khan made a decision of absolute pragmatism. He did not develop siege technology from first principles. He captured people who already knew how and made them work for him. Chinese engineers, Persian engineers, later specialists from every civilization. The empire absorbed, protected from the general violence that accompanied resistance, transported with the army, given materials and labor, and the clear understanding that their survival depended on their continued usefulness. They built trebuchets that threw stones, weighing 200 pounds, counterweight, engines that operated continuously for days, battering the same section of wall with a patience defenders could not indefinitely match. Mobile towers, undermining operations that collapsed, foundations, incendiary projectiles, naphtha, burning material that continued burning even when wet, that set wooden structures inside fortifications ablaze before a single scaling ladder was raised. At Xiangyang, the fortress city that guarded the Yangtze approach to southern China, that had held against the Mongols for 5 years, engineers brought from Persia built counterweight trebuchets of a design not previously seen in China. When the first stone struck, a Chinese chronicler recorded that the sound shook the earth and the population of the city collapsed in terror. Xiangyang surrendered shortly after. There was no wall, given time and resources, that the Mongol army could not reduce. No fortress that could not be taken. The only defenses that worked against them were the ones that removed their advantages by accident or geography. Navies on open water, terrain so dense and what that horses were useless, or the death of a Khan pulling an army home before the work was done. No human-designed military system defeated them. Not once. Not in the lifetime of Genghis Khan. Not in the generation after him. The machine was simply that good. The intelligence network. Before every major campaign, before a single column move, before the first warrior crossed the border, the Mongols knew. They knew the roads and the river crossings and the mountain passes. They knew the strength of each city's garrison and the temperament of its commander, whether that commander was a political appointment who would crack under pressure or a professional who would need to be fought properly. They knew where the food stores were, where the water sources were, which populations were resentful of their rulers and might cooperate with an invader who promised something better. They knew because they sent people to find out months, sometimes years, before the army moved. The Mongol intelligence network was the most sophisticated information gathering operation of the medieval world. It worked because of two things. The Mongols understood better than anyone else in their era. First, merchants see everything. A merchant traveling a trade route passes through cities and border posts and river crossings. He asks questions that are entirely natural for a merchant to ask. What is the price of grain here? How long is the road to the next city? Are the passes safe this season? Who controls the toll stations? Nobody questions a merchant asking these things. Everybody questions a soldier asking them. The Mongols used merchants as intelligence agents consistently enough that when a Mongol army appeared knowing things it should not have known about a target's internal politics and defensive arrangements, the reason was often a merchant who had passed through months earlier asking the normal questions of trade, carrying the answers home on horseback. Second, unhappy people will help you destroy the power that is making them unhappy. The Mongols were skilled at identifying and cultivating disaffected populations inside target territories, persecuted religious minorities, overtaxed merchant classes, ambitious subordinates who wanted what their superiors had. Every human society contains people who have reason to want the current order changed, and the Mongols found them and promised them something better and then, critically, often delivered on those promises in the territories they absorbed. The religious tolerance was genuine, and it was consistent. This surprises people who carry only the simple image of the Mongols as destroyers. The Yasa, the Great Law Code, explicitly protected religious practice. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Taoism, shamanism, Judaism, all permitted. Religious leaders exempted from taxation. Clergy of all faiths not to be harmed. Genghis Khan was a shamanist who believed in the eternal blue sky and seems to have had a genuine personal curiosity about religious questions. He held formal debates between representatives of different faiths and listened with what witnesses described as real attention. But the policy of tolerance was also fundamentally useful. A population fearing religious persecution fights to the last to defend its practices. A population guaranteed religious freedom by the conquering power has one less reason to fight. The Mongols removed reasons to fight wherever they could. What remained was the choice: submit and survive, resist and die. The communication system wove through all of it. The the relay station network that Genghis Khan had established for military communication, and that OGDI had expanded into a continental infrastructure, gave the Mongol command structure something no medieval army could match: real-time operational coordination. In a conventional medieval army, a commander in the field was effectively isolated. He made decisions based on whatever information he had at the moment of decision. If the situation changed, if a friendly force was destroyed, if a new enemy appeared on the flank, if the target had been reinforced, he might not learn of it for days or weeks. He operated in a fog that was not merely psychological but literal. The yam cut through this fog. A Mongol general could receive information from 100 miles away in hours, could send orders, and know they had been received. When multiple columns operated simultaneously as subunits, operational style required, they could coordinate in something approaching real time, adjusting their movements in response to each other's situations in ways that no other army of the period could even conceptualize. A Mongol campaign involving 5 separate columns across 500 miles of front had more tactical coordination than most armies could achieve with forces in direct visual contact. The logistics completed the picture. An army marches on its stomach. This truth is as old as armies. What made the Mongol military unique was the degree to which sustainability had been built into the army's fundamental nature rather than treated as a separate problem. The horses required no grain. They carried no fodder. They ate what they found, which meant the army's primary animals were also self-provisioning, in a way that the war horses of settled armies, dependent on daily grain rations, could never be. The warriors traveled light. Each carried his equipment and weapons, dried meat and dried milk curds that could sustain him for days without resupply, and the knowledge drilled into him since childhood through the nurge and the annual hunts of how to find food in country that looked barren to a city-bred soldier. They drove herds of animals with the army, cattle and sheep consumed as needed, replaced continuously by the animals of conquered territories. The army absorbed the resources of the land it moved through rather than depending on a fixed supply line that could be cut. You cannot defeat an army by cutting supply lines that do not exist as fixed things. You cannot starve a force that eats the countryside as it moves. Speed, terror, intelligence, tolerance, communication, logistics, the feigned retreat, the composite bow, the self-provisioning horse, the siege engineer, taken from each conquered civilization and turned against the next one. Each element reinforced every other. Together they created something that military historians, studying it 8 centuries later with the full analytical toolkit of modern strategic theory, still describe with a word not often used in academic writing about armies. They call it beautiful. Not the killing, not the cities burned, and the libraries destroyed and the 40 million dead. Never that. The system, the architecture, the way each component fitted into every other, with the clean precision of something built by a single mind working over a lifetime toward a single coherent vision. It was the most complete military system the pre-modern world ever produced. And it had one vulnerability, one weakness that no engineering could address no training could prevent. No tactical genius could plan around. It required a Khan. Not just any Khan. Not just a competent ruler or a capable general or a man of reasonable intelligence and adequate will. It required the particular quality of mind and will and vision that Genghis Khan possessed, that absolute, unshakable certainty of purpose that infected everyone around him and turned a collection of tribes into a single organism with a single direction. When he was gone, the machine kept running. For a generation it ran almost as well. Subutai at Mohi, Hulagu at Baghdad, the Yuan armies sweeping through southern China. The momentum carried. But momentum, without the force that created it, eventually slows. The Khanates were dividing. The single will was fracturing into four. The most perfect military system the world had ever seen was becoming, slowly and then faster, something that could still win battles but could no longer reshape the world. The wind still moved across the steppe. The horses still grazed in the golden light. But the hoofbeats of the great campaigns were growing quieter, the distances between them larger. The world the Mongols had shaken to its foundations was finding, slowly and carefully and with the particular relief of something that has survived what should have destroyed it, its footing again. The machine was winding down, but what it had built, what it had connected and destroyed and transformed and left behind, that was permanent. That was just beginning to be understood. Empires do not fall the way buildings fall. A building collapses in a moment, one crack, one failure of load-bearing structure, one catastrophic instant when everything that was standing is suddenly not. You can point to the moment. You can say there, that is when it ended. Empires are different. Empires dissolve. They fray at the edges. First, then deeper still, the center holding long after the periphery has already become something else. They change form without admitting they have changed. They maintain the language of unity, the titles, the ceremonies, the fiction of a single authority, long after the reality of unity has quietly departed. They are like a great river delta where the same water that was once one powerful current becomes, gradually and then suddenly, 100 smaller channels, each finding its own way to the sea. The Mongol Empire dissolved this way. Not in a day, not in a decade. Over a century of fragmentation so gradual that the people living through it could not always see it happening, could not always distinguish between the temporary political crises that every large state experiences and the permanent structural unraveling that only becomes visible in retrospect. But it happened. And to understand how it happened, to understand why the largest empire the world had ever produced could not hold itself together, you have to start where all Mongol stories start, with a death. Ogdi died in 1241. Gayak died in 1248. Monk died in 1259. 3 Grand Khans in 18 years, and each death triggered a succession crisis that consumed enormous political energy, that forced military campaigns to halt mid-stride, that pulled princes and generals away from the frontiers and toward Karakoram and the deadly politics of the Kurultai. The Mongol succession system was, in a word, broken. Genghis Khan had invented a system for choosing leaders, the Kurultai, the Great Assembly, that was genuinely democratic in its origins, genuinely meritocratic in its ideal, The assembled leadership of the Mongol world would gather and ratify the best man for the position. Blood mattered. You had to be of the Golden family, descended from Genghis Khan, to be eligible, but within that bloodline, ability was supposed to be the deciding factor. The problem was that the Golden family was growing. Genghis Khan had 4 sons by Borte. Each of those sons had multiple sons. Each of those grandsons had sons of their own. Within 2 generations, the pool of men with legitimate claims to senior positions in the empire had expanded from a handful to dozens, and each of them had followers and armies and the kind of pride that does not easily accept being passed over. The Kurultai that was supposed to choose the best man became increasingly an arena where factions fought for their preferred candidate, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through bribery, sometimes through the implicit threat of the armies massed outside the tent. Regents held power during the gaps between khans. Regents were almost always women, the great Khatans, the senior wives of dead khans, who administered the empire during the sometimes years-long periods between one ruler's death and the next ruler's confirmation. Torajin Khatan, Ogdi's widow, Ago Kamish, Diak's widow. These women were not figureheads. They were administrators of genuine skill, who kept the machinery of empire running while the men argued about who should lead it. But they could not hold the center indefinitely. And when Monk died in 1259, died in the field during the campaign against the Song dynasty, the campaign unfinished, the armies in China and Persia suddenly leaderless at the worst possible moment. The crisis that followed was different in kind from the ones before it. This time, the empire did not reassemble. Kublai was in China, conducting the southern campaign. His younger brother Erik Bok was in Karakorum, the Mongolian heartland, with control of the administrative apparatus and the loyalty of the traditional Mongol nobility. The men who believed the empire should be governed from the steppe, should maintain its nomadic character, should not be seduced by the luxury and the sophistication of the settled civilizations it had conquered. Both brothers held Kurultais. Both brothers were declared Grand Khan. The civil war that followed lasted 4 years, 1260 to 1264, and it was fought not just between 2 brothers but between 2 visions of what the Mongol Empire was supposed to be. Erik Bok represented the steppe, the old ways, the Feldger, and the open sky and the horse, and the bow and the absolute primacy of the Mongol way of life that Genghis Khan had built his empire upon. Kublai represented something new, something that made the traditional Mongol nobility deeply uncomfortable. He had grown up fascinated by Chinese civilization. He had employed Chinese advisors. He had built a Chinese-style capital, Xanadu, the legendary Xanadu, before the war with his brother even began. He understood that ruling 100 million Chinese people required governing like a Chinese emperor, not like a Mongol Khan. He was right. Erik Bok was also right. That was the tragedy. Both men saw something true about the empire. Kublai saw that the future required adaptation, that an empire built on conquest could only sustain itself by becoming something the conquered peoples could live inside something that served their needs as well as extracting their resources. Eric Boak saw that adaptation meant transformation, that a Mongol empire that governed like China was, in some essential sense, no longer a Mongol empire. He was also right. Kublai won the war. Eric Boak surrendered in 1264, was pardoned. Kublai could not bring himself to execute his own brother, and died 2 years later, possibly of grief, possibly of something more deliberate. The sources are not clear. But winning this civil war cost Kublai something he could never recover: legitimacy among the other Khanates. The rulers of the Golden Horde in Russia, descendants of Jochi, always somewhat apart, always somewhat resentful of the center, refused to recognize Kublai as Grand Khan. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, traditionally conservative, aligned with Eric Boak's vision, also withheld recognition. The Ilkhanate in Persia, Hulagu's descendants, recognized Kublai, but only because Hulagu and Kublai had been close, and the recognition was personal rather than institutional. After 1264, the fiction of a unified empire was over. The reality was 4 successor states, each going its own way, each becoming, slowly and then completely, something other than what Genghis Khan had built. The Golden Horde, west of the Urals, across the vast grasslands of southern Russia and Kazakhstan, where the Volga flows south toward the Caspian and the steppe stretches in every direction, as far as the eye can reach. Here, the Western Mongol state took root and became something extraordinary. The Golden Horde, so named, probably from the golden color of Bada Khan's great tent, the order that gave the English language. The word horde was in many ways the most purely Mongol of the successor states. It sat on the steppe. It was ruled by rulers who lived, at least partially, in the nomadic style. It maintained the military culture and the horse culture that Genghis Khan had built the empire upon. But it was also, from very early, something new. Bata Khan, who had conquered Russia and driven to the gates of Vienna and then turned back to deal with Ogdi's succession, established his capital at Sarai, on the lower Volga. Sarai was a city, a real city, with permanent buildings and a population that grew over time to rival the great cities of the settled world. It had mosques and Orthodox Christian churches and Buddhist temples, and a market where merchants from every corner of the known world came to trade. Because the Golden Horde sat astride the most important trade routes between Europe and Asia, it became enormously wealthy without having to conquer anything. Further, the merchants paid, the tolls accumulated, the horde grew rich on the commerce that flowed through its territory the way a river grows a delta, spreading wealth in every direction, while the source kept flowing. The relationship with Russia was the defining political fact of the Golden Horde's existence. Russia was not destroyed. Russia was not incorporated into the Horde as a direct administrative territory. Russia was subjugated, forced to pay tribute, required to send princes to Sarai to receive patents of authority from the Khan, subject to periodic punitive raids when payments were late or local resistance flared. The Russian princes learned to navigate this system with the particular skill of people who have no alternative. They traveled to Sarai. They prostrated themselves before the Khan. They paid. They competed with each other for Mongol favor, using Mongol backing as a tool in their internal politics. The Prince of Moscow, for instance, became extraordinarily useful to the horde as a tax collector, and in return received Mongol support against his Russian rivals. The irony, one of history's great terrible ironies, is that the Mongol system of political subjugation taught the Russian princes exactly the administrative and political skills they would later use to build their own empire. The centralization of power, the management of vast territory from a single point, the use of calculated violence as a tool of political discipline, the subordination of local autonomy to central authority. The Russian Tsars, who would eventually expand their empire across Siberia to the Pacific, who would build the largest country by territory in the history of the world, were, in a very real sense, students of the Mongols. They had watched the system operate on them for 2 centuries and learned its lessons completely. The Golden Horde converted to Islam. This happened under Ozbeg Khan, the greatest of the horde's later rulers, who reigned from 1313 to 1341 and made the conversion of the horde to Sunni Islam a matter of state policy. It was a significant departure from the traditional Mongol religious tolerance, not persecutory, but a clear statement of identity, a decision about what the Golden Horde was going to be as a civilization, rather than merely as a military power. Ozbeg's horde was, under his rule, one of the most powerful states in the world. The Italian city-states, Genoa and Venice, maintained trading colonies on the Black Sea coast with his permission, paying substantial fees for the privilege of access to the routes that ran through his territory. The Egyptian Mamluks maintained diplomatic relations. The Byzantine Empire sent embassies. The horde was a great power. And then came 1346. A Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula, Kaffa, a fortified city on the Black Sea coast, was besieged by a Golden Horde army. The siege was not going well for the horde. Something was killing their soldiers in large numbers. Something invisible. Something that moved through the camp faster than any human enemy could move, something that killed without warning in days. The plague, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, had been moving westward along the Silk Road, the trade routes that the Mongol peace had made so safe. For merchants were also, it turned out, safe for the flea that carried the plague on the rat that traveled in the merchant's cart. The Mongol commander at Kaffa, watching his army die, made a decision that was either an act of biological warfare or simply a desperate attempt to use his dead for something useful. He had the bodies of plague victims catapulted over the walls of the Genoese city. The Genoese ships that fled Kaffa carried the plague to Constantinople. From Constantinople it spread to Sicily, from Sicily to the Italian peninsula, from Italy to France, to England, to the rest of Europe. The Black Death, the plague that killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population in 4 years, the greatest demographic catastrophe in the history of the Western world arrived in Europe on Genoese ships that had fled a Mongol siege. The connectivity that the Mongol peace had created, the roads, the trade routes, the movement of people and goods and animals across the entire breadth of Eurasia, carried the disease the way it carried everything else. Fast, efficiently, with the complete indifference to human borders and political arrangements that characterized everything the Mongol system touched. The Golden Horde was devastated too. The plague did not spare the Horde, because the Horde had been its vehicle. The same connectivity that sent the plague west killed enormous numbers of people in the Horde's own territory. Ozbeg's great state never fully recovered. The century after his death was a century of fragmentation, of rival claimants, of Russian princes testing the strength of their overlords and finding it diminished, of a slow recession of Mongol power that had once seemed as permanent as the steppe itself. In 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, a Russian force under Dmitry Donskoy defeated a Golden Horde army in open battle for the first time. The Horde recovered and continued for another century. But Kulikovo was a signal, a change in the direction of the tide that everyone watching could feel, even if no one could yet define it precisely. The Horde that had conquered Russia was becoming a thing that Russia would eventually conquer. It would take until 1502, when the Crimean Khanate, a successor state to the Golden Horde, sacked Sarai and ended the last pretense of the Horde's existence as a unified power, but the direction had been set. 260 years of Mongol dominance over Russia were ending. Russia would remember. It would remember for centuries the memory of submission, the particular psychological texture of a civilization that had prostrated itself before a foreign power for 260 years, would shape Russian identity, Russian foreign policy, Russian attitudes toward its own borders and its own security in ways that historians are still mapping. The Golden Horde was gone, but its shadow remained. The Ilkhanate burned brightest and died first. Hulagu Khan, third son of Talyui, brother of Monk and Kublai, the man who had destroyed Baghdad and ended the Abbasid Caliphate, established his state across the territory of modern Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and parts of Turkey and Afghanistan. He called himself Ilkhan, subordinate Khan, a title that acknowledged Kublai's nominal seniority even as the practical reality of the distance between them made the acknowledgement purely ceremonial. The Ilkhanate was the most culturally dynamic of the successor states. Sitting at the crossroads of the Islamic world, the Byzantine world, and the Mongol East, it absorbed influences from every direction, with the particular openness of a state that had no deep cultural roots of its own and therefore no instinct to resist what was new. Persian became the language of the court, the literary and administrative language of the Islamic world, sophisticated and ancient and extraordinarily beautiful. The Ilkhans patronized Persian poetry and architecture and miniature painting with a generosity that produced some of the greatest art of the medieval Islamic world. Hulagu himself was a Buddhist, whose favorite wife, Dokas Khatun, was a Nestorian Christian. He employed Persian administrators and tolerated the Islamic scholars and mystics of his territory with the standard Mongol indifference to religious difference. his relationship with the surviving Christian kingdoms of the Middle East, the Crusader states, the Armenian kingdom, the Georgian kingdom, was complex and sometimes close because they shared an enemy in the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Great might have been of medieval history, a Mongol crusader alliance that destroyed the Mamluk Sultanate and reshaped the Middle East entirely. It was discussed. Embassies were exchanged. The possibility was real for a decade or more. It never happened. The timing was always wrong. The Crusader states, weakened, fractious, deeply suspicious of any power they did not control, could not coordinate their response. The Mongols moved on schedules that the Crusaders could not predict. The alliance that might have changed everything remained an alliance of letters and intentions and missed opportunities. The Ilkhanate converted to Islam. This happened in 1295, under Genghis Khan, one of the most remarkable rulers the dynasty produced, a man who was simultaneously a committed Muslim convert, a Mongol warrior of genuine ability, a patron of Persian art and scholarship, and a reforming administrator who restructured the Ilkhanates' finances and military with a systematic intelligence that recalled his great-grandfather. Ghazan's conversion was politically significant beyond the religious dimension. It completed the Ilkhanates' transformation from a Mongol occupying force into something the population it ruled could recognize as legitimately theirs. A Muslim ruler governing a Muslim population speaking Persian, patronizing Islamic culture. This was no longer the alien steppe power that had burned Baghdad. It was, increasingly, a Persian Islamic state that happened to have been founded by Mongols. Ghazan died in 1304. His brother, Al-Jaytu, continued the cultural flourishing, building the magnificent mausoleum at Sultania that still stands in northwestern Iran, one of the greatest architectural achievements of the medieval world. Its vast turquoise dome visible for miles across the plateau. And then the Ilkhanate simply ran out of successors who could hold it together. After Al-Jaytu's son Abu Said died in 1335 without an heir, the state fractured almost immediately into competing dynasties, local rulers who had been holding power in the name of the Ilkhan now holding it for themselves. The Jalayirids in Iraq, the Muzaffarids in Fars, the Sarbadars in Khorasan, a dozen smaller powers filling the vacuum that the Ilkhanates' dissolution created. The Ilkhanate was over by 1357. It had lasted less than a century. But what it had built, the synthesis of Mongol political authority and Persian cultural tradition, the patronage networks that had produced miniature painting and epic poetry and architectural innovation, survived the state that created it. The Chagatai Khanate was the most troubled of the four. Named for Genghis Khan's second son, the most conservative of his children, the most committed to the steppe traditions, the most resistant to the cultural accommodation that the other successor states practiced. The Chagatai Khanate sat in Central Asia, straddling the great Silk Road cities of Samarkand and Bokhara and the nomadic steppe to their north. The fundamental tension of the Chagatai Khanate was the tension between the settled and the nomadic that had defined the Mongol story from the beginning. The urban population of the Silk Road cities, Persian-speaking, Muslim, sophisticated, tied to agriculture and trade, and the accumulated material culture of centuries coexisted uneasily with the nomadic Mongol and Turkic populations of the steppe. To the north, the Chagatai Khans spent 2 centuries trying to hold these 2 worlds together and mostly failing. The Khanates split into eastern and western halves. Rival claimants fought. Alliances with other Khanates were made and broken. The great cities that generated the wealth that everyone was fighting over suffered periodic devastation from the civil wars fought in their vicinity, and then from the wreckage of the Western Chagatai Khanate. In the second half of the 14th century rose a figure who would briefly reignite the Mongol terror in the minds of everyone from Delhi to Damascus. Timur. Timur the Lame, Tamerlane in the European rendering. Not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. He was a Turco-Mongol of the Barlas clan who claimed legitimacy through a Chinggisid wife and the titles of those he conquered, rather than through his own bloodline. But a man who had absorbed everything the Mongol tradition had to teach about war and conquest, and the strategic use of terror. His campaigns, conducted between 1370 and his death in 1405, killed an estimated 17 million people. He devastated Persia, which had barely recovered from the Ilkhanates' depredations. He invaded India and sacked Delhi, massacring the population with a thoroughness that set Indian civilization back by generations. He defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid in battle and had him displayed in a cage. He destroyed the Golden Horde as a coherent power, raiding Sarai and ending the last pretense of its dominance. He died in 1405 while preparing to invade China. Kublai's Yuan dynasty, the last of the 4 successor states to discuss, had already fallen. By then, the Chinese had risen in 1368 under the Ming dynasty, driving the Mongol rulers north, back onto the steppe, back to the felt jars and the open sky that Erik Boke had wanted to preserve, and Kublai had moved away from. The Mongols returned to Mongolia. They were still there, still powerful by the standards of the steppe, still dangerous to the Ming dynasty that watched them nervously from behind. The Great Wall they rebuilt and extended precisely because the Mongol threat had never entirely gone away. But the empire was over. The world that Genghis Khan had built in a single lifetime, that extraordinary, terrible, creative, destructive construction, had taken less than a century and a half to become 4 separate things, and less than 2 centuries after that to become history. The grass grew back over the roads between Sarai and Karakoram. The relay stations of the Am fell into disrepair, their roofs collapsing, their horses gone. The messages they had carried at such miraculous speed no longer needing to be sent. The great empire of the felt walls and the open sky was over. What it had left behind, in the shape of nations, in the flow of trade routes, in the spread of technologies and diseases and ideas, in the DNA of populations, from Korea to Hungary, was permanent, is permanent. The wind moves across the steppe. The grass bends. The 4 Khanates are dust. But the world they made is the world we live in. History does not give clean verdicts. This is the thing that separates genuine Historical understanding from the comfortable. Stories we tell ourselves about the past. The thing that makes real history harder than myth and more valuable than legend. Myth gives you heroes and villains. Legend gives you causes and effects that line up neatly, that point in one direction, that allow you to feel certain about what happened and why it mattered. History gives you the Mongols. And the Mongols do not fit. They do not fit the story of pure destruction. Because the empire they built connected the world in ways that made the modern age possible. Carried ideas and technologies and peoples across distances that nothing before them had bridged, created conditions that scholars and merchants and artists and scientists used to do things that changed everything. They do not fit the story of enlightened empire, because the path to that connected world ran through the ruins of Baghdad and the bones of Merv and the ashes of 100 cities whose names we have half forgotten, because the people who would have remembered them were killed before they could pass the memory on. They are both things at once. They are always both things at once. And the question of what they left behind. The question of legacy, the question of what the largest empire in human history ultimately meant, cannot be answered by choosing one of those two stories and ignoring the other. It has to hold both. Begin with the dead. The numbers are so large they stop meaning anything in the way that numbers are supposed to mean things. 40 million people. Some estimates go higher, 60 million, 70 million, across the full span of the Mongol conquest, from the campaigns of Genghis Khan through the campaigns of his grandsons, in a world whose total population was somewhere between 300 and 400 million people. This represents, depending on which estimate you accept, between 10 and 20% of every human being alive on Earth. 10 to 20% gone. Not in a plague, not in a famine, not in the slow grinding mortality of poverty and disease that killed most people in the pre-modern world, but in organized, directed, deliberately administered violence on a scale that has no parallel in human history before the 20th century. The demographic collapse in certain regions was so total that it took centuries to recover. Iran, the great heartland of the Khwarezmian Empire, the center of Persian civilization, one of the most densely populated and agriculturally productive regions in the medieval world, lost between half and 3/4 of its population in the Mongol conquest. The irrigation systems that had supported that population for 2,000 years were destroyed deliberately and systematically, because destroying the agricultural infrastructure of a conquered territory was a standard element of Mongol strategy. It prevented rebellion. It removed the economic base that could support a recovering enemy. It turned potential resistance into survival. Those irrigation systems were never fully rebuilt. The population that Iran had in 1220, before the Mongols arrived, was not reached again until the 20th century. 700 years. Iraq, the heartland of the Abbasid Caliphate, the site of Baghdad, the region that had been continuously inhabited and continuously productive for 6,000 years, suffered a similar collapse. The great agricultural systems of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, built and maintained over millennia, were damaged so severely that they never recovered to their pre-Mongol productivity. The desert that covers much of modern Iraq, a desert that was not there before the 13th century, or not to the same extent, is partly the Mongols' legacy. China, the Qing dynasty territories in the north, lost perhaps a third of its population. The Song dynasty territories in the south, absorbed over decades of brutal campaigning, that ended in 1279, lost millions more. Russia lost cities, populations, generations of accumulated cultural and economic development. This is the weight that any honest accounting of the Mongol legacy must begin with. Not as condemnation. Condemnation is too easy, too comfortable, too much like the clean verdict that history refuses to give. But as fact, as the foundation on which everything else must be placed so that the everything else is understood correctly. Understood as something built on ruins. Understood as progress purchased at a price so enormous that the purchase can never be simply celebrated. The Black Death. The plague that killed between a third and a half of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, the greatest demographic catastrophe in European history, the event that ended the medieval world and began the long, painful birth of the modern one, traveled to Europe on the trade routes that the Mongol peace had made safe. The connectivity that was the empire's greatest achievement was also the vector for its most devastating unintended consequence. The roads that carried silk and spices and paper and ideas also carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium of bubonic plague, westward from Central Asia, faster and more efficiently than it could ever have traveled before the roads existed. The Mongols did not create the plague, but they created the conditions under which it could kill more people more quickly, across a greater area, than any disease in the history of the world had ever managed. The Black Death killed perhaps 50 million people in Europe alone. It killed enormous numbers across the Middle East and Central Asia and China. The total death toll of the pandemic spread along the Mongol roads through the Mongol trading networks across the connected world that the empire had built may have exceeded the death toll of the conquests themselves. This too is legacy. This too must be held alongside everything else. And yet, the world after the Black Death was not the world before the Mongols. It could not have been, even without the plague. The century of the Pax Mongolica, the century of connected roads and guaranteed trade and the movement of ideas and peoples and goods across the entire breadth of Eurasia, had changed things that could not be unchanged. It had shown that the world was connectable. It had demonstrated in practice on a scale that could not be dismissed or ignored that people and goods and knowledge could move from one end of the earth to the other, and that the movement enriched everyone it touched. That knowledge did not disappear when the empire fragmented. It became the foundation of what came next. The technologies traveled. This is perhaps the most concrete and measurable element of the Mongol legacy, the one that can be traced most directly, most specifically, from cause to effect, across the centuries that followed the empire's peak. Paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, stirrups, blast furnaces, noodles, playing cards. These things did not simply appear in Europe by accident or independent invention in the centuries after the Mongol Empire. They traveled, they moved along the roads that the empire had built and maintained, carried by merchants and diplomats and missionaries and refugees and soldiers and every other category of human being that the connected world set in motion. Paper had existed in China for over 1,000 years before the Mongol conquests. Printing, woodblock printing, and later, movable type, had been developed in China centuries before Gutenberg. The Mongol Empire created the conditions under which these technologies could move westward at a speed and scale that isolated regions and intermittent trade could never have achieved. When Gutenberg printed his Bible in 1455, the event that historians conventionally mark as the beginning of the information revolution that would produce the Renaissance and the Reformation and the scientific revolution and the entire intellectual architecture of the modern world, he was working with a technology that had come to Europe along roads built by people whose names he did not know and whose empire had ended a century before he was born. Gunpowder changed warfare forever. The Europe that emerged from the Middle Ages into the age of exploration and conquest, the Europe that would send ships around Africa and across the Atlantic, that would build the colonial empires that shaped the modern world, was armed with cannon and musket and the military technology that gunpowder made possible. That technology came from China. It traveled west along the Silk Road. It arrived in Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, the centuries of the Mongol Empire and its immediate aftermath. The compass made navigation possible at a scale and precision that previous generations could not achieve. Columbus used a compass. Vasco da Gama used a compass. The age of exploration, the event that connected the old world to the new world that created the global economy we still live inside, was made possible by an instrument that traveled to Europe along the same roads. These are not coincidences. They are the mechanism by which one civilization's knowledge becomes another civilization's revolution. The Mongol Empire was the greatest technology transfer event in the history of the pre-modern world. Not because the Mongols invented anything, they were not great inventors, not great scientists, not great architects or scholars or artists, in the way that the civilizations they conquered were. They were great connectors. They were great movers. They were the force that took what existed and separated isolated pockets of human civilization and put it in motion, that created the conditions under which knowledge could not stay local, could not stay contained, could not remain the property of the civilization that created it. They broke the walls between worlds, the walls that had kept Chinese technology in China and Persian astronomy in Persia, and Indian mathematics in India, the walls of distance and danger and political fragmentation that made the movement of ideas slow and uncertain and dependent on the particular courage of individual travelers. Those walls came down when the Mongols came through, and when empires fall, the walls don't always go back up in the same places. The people move too. This is the human dimension of the legacy, the one that shows up not in trade records or technology timelines but in the genetic record of populations, in the surnames of families in places far from Mongolia, in the DNA studies that have found Mongol genetic markers in populations from Korea to Ireland. Genghis Khan is, by some estimates, the most prolific biological ancestor in human history. Studies of Y chromosome DNA have identified a genetic signature carried by approximately 16 million men living today that appears to descend from a single individual who lived in Mongolia approximately 800 years ago. The mathematics of how that signature spread point to a man who had access to women across an unprecedented geographic range, a man whose sons and grandsons ruled empires and had the same access their ancestor had. 16 million living descendants. The largest single family in human history. But the movement of people was not only the movement of conquerors. The Mongol conquest set millions of people in motion. Refugees, slaves, craftsmen, scholars, merchants, soldiers, who moved across the world and settled in new places and carried their languages and their knowledge and their cultural practices with them. The Turkic-speaking peoples of Central Asia were scattered and relocated by the Mongol conquests in patterns that shaped the ethnic and linguistic map of the region in ways still visible today. Persian scholars fleeing the destruction of one city found refuge in another and carried the intellectual traditions of their civilization to courts that became new centers of learning. Chinese craftsmen taken to Persia influenced Persian art in ways you can still see in the miniature paintings of the Ilkhanate period, the Chinese landscape conventions, the particular way clouds are painted, the dragons that appear in Islamic art after the Mongol period and did not appear before. The world after the Mongols was not the world before them. It was more mixed, more traveled, more aware of its own extent, more conscious of the fact that beyond the horizon, in whatever direction you chose to look, there were other people, other civilizations, other ways of organizing human life that had things worth knowing and things worth trading. This consciousness, this awareness of the world's fullness, its extent, its overwhelming variety, is one of the things the Mongol century gave to the civilizations that survived it. It is not a small thing. It may be the largest thing, because from it, from that awareness, from that appetite for connection and exchange that the Mongol roads had created and the Mongol peace had made habitual, came the impulse that sent European sailors around the Cape of Good Hope and across the Atlantic. They were looking for the roads that the Mongols had built, the roads that the fall of the empire and the rise of the Ottoman Empire had made difficult again. They wanted to get to China, to the spices and the silks and the porcelain, and the wealth that Marco Polo had described, that a Venetian merchant had seen at the court of Kublai Khan, and written about in a book that Europeans read for 2 centuries with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. Columbus was trying to reach Kublai Khan's China when he found America. He died believing he had. The Mongol Empire was over. But its gravitational pull, the hunger it had created for the connected world, it had briefly made real, was still shaping the direction of human movement. A century and a half after the last Khanate fell. The nations. This is the legacy that is hardest to see, because it is so completely absorbed into the world we inhabit that it has become invisible, the way the foundation of a building is invisible once the building is finished, present in everything, acknowledged in nothing. The nations that exist today, the borders, the political structures, the ethnic and linguistic identities that organize human life across the Eurasian continent, were shaped by the Mongol Empire in ways that cannot be separated from what those nations are now. Russia. Russia is perhaps the clearest case. 260 years of Mongol domination, of the golden hordes, overlordship, of the requirement to travel to Sarai and prostrate before the Khan, of the administrative systems that the Russian princes learned from their conquerors and the political habits that 2.5 centuries of subjugation instilled, shaped Russia in ways that Russian historians have argued about for centuries and will argue about for centuries more. The centralization of power in Moscow, the particular Russian tradition of autocracy, of a single central authority, subordinating regional powers of the state as the supreme organizing principle of national life, has roots in the Mongol period that are not coincidental. The princes of Moscow became powerful, in part because the Mongols found them useful as tax collectors. They learned the administrative methods of their overlords. They absorbed the political logic of a system that concentrated authority at the center and demanded total submission from the periphery. When the Mongol power receded, the Russian princes who filled the vacuum governed in ways that the Mongols would have recognized. The Russian Empire that eventually spread across Siberia to the Pacific, the largest country by territory in the world today, was built using methods and moving in directions that the Mongol example had established. The expansion eastward into the steppe and then beyond it followed routes that Mongol armies had traveled. The administrative structures used to govern vast distances and diverse populations were adaptations of systems the Russians had lived inside for 2.5 centuries. Russia is, in a very real and specific sense, partly a Mongol creation. Not in its culture, not in its language, not in its identity as it understands itself, but in the shape of its power, in the logic of its expansion, in the habits of governance that the Mongol period installed and that proved too useful to abandon even after the Mongols were gone. China. The Yuan dynasty ended in 1368, driven north by the Ming Rebellion. But the Mongol period had changed China in ways that the Ming could not entirely reverse even when they tried. The administrative integration of the vast territory that is modern China, the connection of northern and southern regions that had been politically separate for centuries, the infrastructure of roads and canals and communication systems that the Yuan had built or maintained, was inherited by the Ming and became the foundation of the unified Chinese state that has persisted, with interruptions, to the present day. The Ming, despite their anti-Mongol rhetoric, governed an empire whose shape the Mongols had defined. They rebuilt the Great Wall, that massive, expensive, ultimately insufficient barrier, partly because the Mongol example had demonstrated with unforgettable clarity what happened when the steppe was unified under a single command and turned toward China's borders. The wall they built was a monument to Mongol memory, Persia and the Islamic world. The destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate, the fall of Baghdad in 1258, the death of the last caliph, the burning of the House of Wisdom, created a vacuum in the center of the Islamic world that was never fully filled in the same way. The Sunni Islamic world had been organized spiritually and politically around the caliphate for 5 centuries. Its end created a decentralization of Islamic authority that persists to the present day, a world in which there is no single center, no single authority, no institution that commands the loyalty of all Sunni Muslims the way the caliphate once did. This is not entirely the Mongols' doing. The caliphate had been weakening for centuries before Hulagu arrived at Baghdad's gates. But the Mongols ended it definitively and permanently, and the Islamic world that exists today, with its multiple centers and competing authorities and the particular complexity of its internal politics, is partly shaped by that ending. The Khanates' conversion to Islam, the absorption of the conquerors by the conquered faith, is its own kind of legacy. The Mongols who burned Baghdad became, within a generation, Muslim rulers of Muslim populations, patronizing Islamic art and architecture and scholarship with a generosity that helped rebuild some of what had been destroyed. The synthesis of Mongol political authority and Persian cultural tradition produced art and architecture of extraordinary beauty, the turquoise domes, the miniature paintings, the epic poetry of the Ilkhanate period that still takes the breath away 8 centuries later. Destruction and creation, always both. The Turkish world, the Ottoman Empire, which would become, by the 15th century, the greatest power in the Islamic world and one of the most significant states in human history, was shaped by the Mongol conquest in ways that are direct and traceable. The Turkic peoples who founded the Ottoman state were set in motion partly by Mongol pressure, displaced from Central Asia, pushed westward into Anatolia, finding in the chaos of the post-Mongol Middle East the space to build something new. The Ottomans were, in a real sense, a Mongol era creation, a state that filled a vacuum the Mongol conquest had opened. Using populations the Mongol conquests had set in motion, in territory the Mongol conquest had restructured. And what of the man himself? What of Genghis Khan, the boy on the banks of the Onan River, the teenager hiding in the freezing water, with a wooden collar around his neck, the young warrior praying on a mountain, before the greatest act of vengeance in the history of the world, the old men dying in a campaign tent with the smell of the gobi on the wind? History has never agreed on him. It probably never will. In Mongolia, he is the founding father, the creator of the nation, the man whose face is on the currency, whose statue stands at the center of the capital, whose name is given to airports and hotels and vodka brands, and the pride that a small nation feels when it remembers that once for one extraordinary century it ruled the world. In Iran and Iraq he is the destroyer, the man whose armies ended a civilization, whose legacy is measured in the silence of cities that once hummed with scholars and poets and the accumulated brilliance of 1,000 years of Islamic learning. In China, he is complicated, a conqueror who became an emperor, a foreigner who built the infrastructure that unified China still uses, a destroyer who was also, in his grandson's hands, a creator. In Russia, he is the darkness, the 2.5 centuries of submission that shaped everything in that Russian national identity has spent centuries trying to process and has not finished processing yet. In Europe, he is the terror that almost came, the army at the gates of Vienna that turned back, the catastrophe that didn't happen, the shadow on the edge of medieval consciousness that colored everything and is still present in the word horde, which once meant an army and now means a crowd and carries in its sound the echo of hoofbeats on the Hungarian plain. He is all of these things. He is none of them completely. He was a man born in a felt tent on the bank of a river in a country most people have never visited, in a year that most people have never thought about. To a father who was poisoned on a road, and a mother who refused to let her children die. He lost everything. He rebuilt everything. He built the largest empire the world has ever seen, and the world has never been the same since. The wind moves across the Mongolian plateau. The grass bends, then straightens, then bends again, as it has done for 10,000 years and will do for 10,000 more. The Onan River runs clear and cold over ancient stones, somewhere beneath the earth of that sacred landscape, somewhere unmarked, somewhere unknown, somewhere the horses have ridden over for 800 years. A man who changed the world is sleeping. History is still arguing about him. It probably always will. And maybe that is the most honest legacy of all. Not a verdict. Not a monument. Not a simple story with a clean ending. Just the argument. Just the ongoing, unresolved, endlessly fascinating argument about what one human life, one extraordinary, terrible, creative, destructive human life, ultimately meant. The steppe keeps its secrets. It always has. But the argument belongs to everyone. It belongs to us. As the sun sets over the empire Genghis Khan built, as the last warriors fade into the grass of the steppe they came from, as the echoes of hoofbeats, 10,000, 100,000, the sound of the largest army the world had ever seen, disappear into the wind. The empire is over. But it never really ended. It transformed. It fractured. It became 4 things, then a dozen things, then 100 small echoes of itself scattered across the largest territory any single will had ever commanded. The roads are still there, buried under centuries of sand and grass and the indifferent weight of time, but there. The routes that connected China to Persia, to Russia, to the edge of Europe, the arteries of the greatest free trade zone the medieval world ever knew, they are still the routes that commerce follows today. The genes are still there. 16 million people walking the earth right now carry in their DNA the signature of one man who was born in a felt tent on the bank of a river that most people have never heard of, in a year that most people have never thought about. The arguments are still there. 8 centuries of historians and scholars and philosophers arguing about what he was, monster or visionary, destroyer or creator, the greatest conqueror who ever lived, or the greatest catastrophe the world has ever suffered, and no one has settled it yet, and no one will. Because he was not one thing. He was never one thing. He was the boy who lost his father at 9 and refused to die. He was the teenager who hid in a freezing river with a wooden collar around his neck and came out the other side still unbroken. He was the young man who rode across the steppe to claim the bride his dead father had promised him, because some promises are worth keeping even when the world has given you every reason to let them go. He was the warrior who built an alliance from nothing, the Khan who destroyed the tribes and made them one people, the conqueror who burned Baghdad and built the roads that carried the Renaissance. He was the man who came from nothing and left his mark on everything, and somewhere beneath the sacred earth of the Mongolian plateau, beneath the grass that bends in the wind as it has bent for 10,000 years, in a grave that no one has ever found and perhaps no one ever will. He is still there, waiting maybe for history to make up its mind about him. It hasn't yet. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think. Monster or visionary? Destroyer or creator? Or something that doesn't fit either word? And tell me, which civilization should we explore next? Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Join the Sleepy America family. Because the greatest stories in history are waiting to be told. Sleep well.
you.